All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below. If you want to support me, only do so if you actually can. The staggering setup of China's demographic situation. So, for anybody who isn't already familiar with it, the new rundown of the math on how it all works out that actually points to their population crash being even steeper than I initially thought it was going to be, and by far, of course, much steeper than China is claiming that it's going to be. They immediately retracted their actual 2023 demographics data and then republished it and bumped their numbers back upwards a little bit. The numbers in question primarily being their birth rate or their fertility rate, which I logged down as the actual numbers when they initially released them, not their quote unquote corrected numbers afterwards, because, and of course, I'm not saying this is what actually happened, most likely they decided after initially admitting that their birth rate had fallen below 1, that the image of that was a bit too final and humiliating, and they probably wanted to at least postpone that for maybe one more year since next year is the most likely year of their Taiwan invasion, and everyone will be distracted with that anyways. And regarding their current population, they peaked a couple of years ago at 1.413 billion, or 1,413,000,000, and declined over the course of 2022 down to 1.412, and last year declined down from 1.412, falling by about 3 million down to 1.409, or 1,409,000,000 people. However, of course, after insisting that that initial data was false, they now claim that they fell by only 2 million instead of 3 million. But in reality, they fell to 1.409. This year they will fall down to most likely 1.405, and next year they'll fall a bit under a flat 1.4, and by the end of the 2020s, they will be in an accelerated dive and will be somewhere between 1.35 and 1.37. The graph I keep showing that I made for their most realistic population projection is, of course, very generalized. Their fertility rate was already plunging to begin with and is clearly chasing after South Korea. Many of the factors contributing to their recent, more abrupt dive being their economic stagnancy developing over the last several years, the increasing over surveillance, social policing, and more open suppression and brutalism of the regime that has also been increasing ever since the later 2010s. So that's the whirlpool of factors and mindsets behind this, behind their fertility rate now falling like a tungsten weight to a point where, as said, it is now below one child per woman, which is obviously a state of half generational replacement. So when you look at their demographic structure, their population pyramid, you see the more modern generation that is much smaller than those two large outward spanning wings or prior generations above them. And then you see the most recent few years at the very bottom, the most recent several years of children being born, and you can see how rapidly those are contracting down to about, or potentially even below, half the size of the generation that is currently having those children. And when your fertility rate is in a state of 1 or below, that pattern is going to continually repeat. Each block of 20 to 30 years or so will contract to half the size of the previous one. And this plays in to population declination counts, population decline counts, or graphing. When you're looking at a population pyramid or a demographic structuring chart, you take the age bars, men and women, that are at the average lifespan, and then you mentally or physically make lines down from that, and from that you can see whether or not the size of the most recent generations being born still expands well beyond, or at least a little beyond, where those lines fall down to, or, as is in the case of China, the newest birth years are contracting inwards rapidly away from those lines. You can see if you progress it out, the lines themselves, because the older, much larger generations are now the ones who will be dying in a very short time, were so much larger than the current generation being born that those lines are also racing outwards away from the already shrinking or contracting newer generations at the very bottom, to a point where they will get up to losing people by the double-digit millions each year, and thus, as shown repeatedly when I put it on the screen before, leading to their projected future population graph coming out to something like this. And while some UN projections will talk about them falling down to 800 by the end of the century, the reality leans much more in the direction of them falling down even just by 2075, where I ended this graph, to around 600 million or less by that point. Because again, their fertility rate is still dropping. It's dropping by a rather decent 8 to 10% each year. China is still nosediving, and their upcoming decisions, most likely next year, although they could do it this year. This year's the first year where I would put the odds of them going for the invasion at 50% or more, but next year is the most likely year. With said upcoming actions and all of the repercussions that are going to come from that, well, that's definitely not going to stop their birth rate from declining any further. So, in all likelihood, they're going to overtake South Korea, and there's a decent enough chance that they are just racing down for zero point 0.5 or something of the sort, which will, of course, see each successive generational block will be 1/4 the size of the previous one, and which would, of course, make even my population projection for them seem way too favorable or way too high. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon links are down there if you want to support me, only do so if you actually can. You can find the population projection graphs of many other countries as I continue to add them in a Google Doc, which is in a Google Drive folder full of various docs, full of free access data and resources, graphs, and all kinds of stuff. The link to that is in the description as well. The link to my Catch channel is in the top pinned comment. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.